Alright, peace to you all. This was going to be part 4 of my video series, but I decided to make it a separate video. This video is specifically geared towards proving that the word more or variations of more can be found all over the globe. A lot of people will have you believe that the word more is referring to a specific group of people who were or are only located in North Africa and what we call the Middle East. But despite the nonsense that people have been spreading, Moors have always existed beyond North Africa and have existed on all lands because we are the original inhabitants of all lands. I'm going to be doing a lot of reading to connect the Moors to all land masses and continents and to prove that we are connected to all ancient cultures and civilizations. The first book source I'm going to be reading from is by Francis Dart Fenton, titled Suggestions for a History of the Origin and Migration of the Maori People, written in 1885. Alright, listen closely and connect the dots. Put the video on full screen if possible so you can see the text. I'm going to read, then summarize. You know what I'm saying? To all my Moors, y'all going to love this. Page 1. Origin of the Polynesian Race. Chapter 1. Chaldea. The islands of the Pacific Ocean are peopled by a dark race or races called Polynesians and Melanesians. The former vary in color from a shade in some of the groups little differing from that of Europeans to a dark brown, sometimes approaching black in others. The Melanesians are, as their name signifies, black or nearly so. Some ethnologists are inclined to think that they are the same race as the Polynesians, and Mr. Coddington find strong similarities in the two languages. Others again are of the opinion that the Melanesians are offshoots of the true Negritian stock, whose presence in these seas it is difficult to explain. I do not propose to extend my inquiries to the Melanesians or to any of the peoples inhabiting the islands from Papua New Guinea to New Caledonia. My remarks will be confined entirely to the race known as Polynesians, who are admitted by all to speak dialects of one common language, and for whom the theory has been set up and largely accepted that the several groups of islands have been successively peopled by migrations from other groups. Page 2. I cannot discover that the inhabitants of any of these groups have any true ethnic designation, with the exception of the Sandwich Islanders, who are called Hawaiians, the New Zealanders, who are called Maori, and the Chatham Islanders, who are known by a similar name, Moriori. According to Dr. Shortland, the Hawaiians are also called Maori. The other islanders are known simply by the names of their islands, as for example Tongans or Samoans. Page 3. It is agreed amongst all the great writers on the early formation and movements of the nations that at the very dawn of history a great Kushite or Ethiopian empire prevailed from the Caucasus to the Indian Ocean, from the shores of the Mediterranean to the mouth of the Ganges, possibly the empire spoken of in the Greek myths as the empire of Dionysus. It is said by some that the founders of this empire migrated into Mesopotamia through Arabia from the part of Africa afterwards called by the Greeks Meroe, and that to a similar movement down the Nile Valley is to be attributed the foundation of the Egyptian Empire. It certainly does appear that there was at one time a gathering of the Kushite people in the Mesopotamian Valley from the southwest, embracing probably the related people of Africa, but the manifestations of this movement are rather those of a return of outposts to the parent hive than of an original swarm. The two views are reconciled by supposing that the eastward movement took place at a later date than the original dispersion of the Kushites from the primeval home of mankind. Indeed, it must be so if the biblical account of the separation of people is accepted. Lepsius combated with great success the view of the African origin of the Egyptians, and a conscientious examination of the authorities results in the entire belief in their Asiatic home, in accordance with the scheme of Gen X. As the origin of the Egyptians is cognate and greatly affects the question of locality of the settlement of the descendants of Cush, Cush and Mizraim were brothers in the genealogical scheme of Gen X. I will quote what Dr. Almir Bey, History of Egypt, says on the constituents of the Egyptian Empire, the more valuable because apparently it is an amended opinion. Though I have expressed the opinion that the Egyptians migrated into Egypt from a primeval home in Asia, yet this idea is opposed by another view, according to which, by a method founded on historical data, the origin of the Egyptian people would have to be sought in the Grecian, Negro, Berber, or Berbers. Page 4. How long the descendants of Cush remained in the hive of the world before they migrated into Arabia, and subsequently into the opposite coasts of Africa, it is impossible to say, nor is it likely that any increased knowledge of the Babylonian libraries will ever satisfactorily establish the chronology of these early periods. That this great and powerful Kushite empire was the dominant one in Chaldea for many centuries is well established, though neither its date nor its limits can be strictly defined. He is sure that some connection existed between ancient Ethiopia and the elevated plains of Central Asia. There were invasions which reached from the shores of Arabia into China. An Arabian sovereign, Shemar-Jarash, is described by Hamza, Nuwari, and others as a powerful ruler and conqueror who carried his arms successfully far into Central Asia. He occupied Samarkand and invaded China. He erected the edifice at Samarkand bearing an inscription in Himyarite or Kushite characters. In the name of his god, Shemar-Jarash has erected this edifice to the sun, his lord. Baldwin, Prehistoric Nations. It appears probable that this military expedition was a later period in the history of the Kushites than the time of the first Kushite Empire, whose principal seat of government was in the Mesopotamian Valley. Probably must be referred to the epoch of the Arabian dynasty in Babylonia, a supposition that is confirmed if it is generally supposed that the Himyaritic characters were imported from Phoenicia. The people of Ad were 1,000 tribes, each composed of several thousands of men. Great conquests are attributed to Shaddad. He subdued, it is said, all Arabia and Iraq. The migration of the Canaanites and their establishment in Syria are by many Arabian writers attributed to an expedition of Shaddad. Great magnificence in buildings and a high state of civilization characterized by the times of this ruler. In other words, an ancient sun-worshipping, powerful, and conquering race overran Arabia at the very dawn of history. In the legends, says Linnerman, we find traces of a wealthy nation constructing great buildings with an advanced civilization analogous to that of Chaldea, professing a similar religion to the Babylonian, a nation, in short, with whom material progress was allied to great depravity and obscene rites. These facts must be true and strictly historical, for they are everywhere met with among the Kushites as among the Canaanites, their brothers by origin. Pay close attention to page 6. I'm going to speak about who the Turanians were when I summarize the book. Is very important. The descendants of Ham or Shem were not, however, the first civilizers of Babylonia. Those far-spreading tribes called by ethnologists Turanian had been beforehand. Page 11. Whether the entire people comprised in the same name, Kushite or Ethiopian, for the words are identical, were at any one time all included in the great Hamite Empire which preceded the Semitic domination in Chaldea, it is impossible now to determine. It is clear, however, that at a later period the Ethiopians of Africa established there a powerful and independent kingdom whose capital was Merik or Meruk, the Chaldean name of a deity recognized as the god of war, corrupted by the Greeks into Meroe. The intercourse between the Arabian Kushites and the African Kushites appears to have been constant down the classical times, and it is occasionally difficult to determine whether the inscriptions on the Egyptian tombs and temples, in speaking of the Holy Land, the land of the gods, Pun or Punt, refer to the African Ethiopia or the Kushite tribes of Arabia. Skipping ahead at page 89, speaking about the Moriori of the Chatham Islands. I confess that how these navigators managed to hit the Chatham Islands has always been, to my mind, a puzzle. All the traditions say that this was a distinct immigration and that the Chathams were not colonized from New Zealand. It must be presumed that when these expeditions were covering the Pacific seas, parties went where the winds took them, and that many of them must have missed land altogether and have never turned up anywhere. Dr. Pickering says that the inhabitants of parts of the Californian coast are of the Polynesian race, and it is extremely probable that some of the fleets may have missed all the islands and continued on until brought up by the continent of America. Alright, skipping ahead to pages 114 and 115. This is the most important part of the book. Pay close attention to the names of the nations. Page 114. New Zealand and the Hawaiian Islands furnish exceptions. In both these groups, the natives are known by the term Maori or Maoli. Although the word Maori is used as an adjective signifying indigenous or sound, healthy, or useful, as Rakau Maori or Wai Maori, as distinguished from the saltwater, yet there is no doubt that it is, as Dr. Shortland shows, a true ethnic title. This view is confirmed by the fact that the Chatham Islanders who arrived by a distinct migration bear the same name, Moriori. This absence of a general national name affords a strong corroborative evidence that the view taken that the people maintained their tribal formation and migrated in tribes is the correct one. The tribal names may be traced through all the wanderings of the Maori people. We can recall the MOORS or Maoris of Luzon, the vernacular word no doubt being Maori, as in Mauritania, whose people we call Moors. Also Pulo Mariere, the Indian island, also the Maruts, the indigenes of Amboina, also the Amharic language, which Rawlinson says greatly assisted him in translating the Babylonian cylinders, and above all the Homeritae, the principal tribe of the Sabians of South Arabia, represented now by the Mahri, which was probably even in the classical times the vernacular word. It is not part of our undertaking to enter into any inquiry as to the subsequent migrations of this ancient race amongst the islands of the Pacific. In such migrations the Maoris have taken no part. The sum of our investigations, I submit, is 1. That the Maoris are the same people as the Maruts, the Moors or Maoris of the Malay archipelago, the Mahri or Homeritae, and Himyarites of South Arabia, and that their eponymic ancestor is Himyar, the third in descent from Joktan, the son of Eber, the ancestor of the Hebrews, and 2. That the other tribes of Polynesia are members of the same great family and nation, branching off, genealogically speaking, from the same stock in the epic of Himyar, and that they, all under the names of Chaldeans, Babylonians, Cushites, Akkadians, or Ethiopians, dwelt together with a representatives of all the Noahic families of man in the plains of Shinyar, from the very earliest ages, speaking a language which bore as much resemblance to the Maori language of today as the Aramaic of Abraham and his ancestors does to the existing Hebrew of that patriarch's descendants, probably much greater resemblance. Beautiful, ain't it? Let me summarize that. So in the beginning, Mr. Fenton starts off by speaking about the dark races called Melanesians and Polynesians. Again, these are not races. These terms, Polynesian, Micronesian, and Melanesian, are European terms to classify the people of the Pacific Islands, who at one time were classified under Blumenbach's Malayan or Brown race. These people are broken up into hundreds of different cultural groups and nationalities. He says that the Melanesians are offshoots of the true Negritian or Negro, and that it is difficult for him to explain their presence in the Pacifics. You know what I'm saying? That's hilarious, ain't it? But and that he will only speak about the so-called Polynesian race. On page 2, Mr. Fenton mentions that there is a similar group who live in the Chatham Islands, which are very close to New Zealand. The Chatham Islanders share a similar name with the Maori, and their nation is called the Moriori. Maori, Moriori. Page 3 is where shit gets real. Early Kushite Empire in Babylonia. Mr. Fenton says that the Kushites prevailed from the Mediterranean all the way to the Ganges of India. You know what I'm saying? Really all of Europe, because we inhabited the entire landmass we now call Europe. I'm going to prove that later on. He said that the Kushites were prevalent in the area known as Mesopotamia, or what is now called the Middle East, and also the Arabian Peninsula. He says that the Kushites were the foundation of the Egyptian Empire, further proving my point that the true Arabs were original dark-skinned peoples of the planet. And he speaks about Dr. Almir Alamgir Bey, who is an imposter attempting to steal our birthright as Moors. You know what I'm saying? Straight up imposter. Has no business doing what he's doing. But Almir Alamgir, in his book A History of Egypt Under the Pharaohs, written in 1879, he attempted to convince readers that the ancient Egyptians were of the so-called Caucasoid or Indo-European race. But here it is, 6 years later in 1885, he admits that due to historical data, aka facts and truth, that the Egyptians originated from the Negritian Berber or Berbers, again proving the point that the original Berbers or Barbars or Berber were indigenous unmixed Africans. On page 4, Mr. Fenton speaks about how the Kushites of Arabia, how the Kushites were dominant in Chaldea, and that the Kushite Empire reached all the way to the plains of Central Asia. On page 4, or page 5, the author states that the Kushites, Babylonians, Chaldeans, and Canaanites are brothers by origin. At the bottom of page 5 and the top of page 6, Mr. Fenton says that the descendants of Ham or Shem were not the first civilizers or inhabitants of Babylonia, and he says that the Turanians were the first inhabitants. Remember I said to keep a mental note of the word Turan or Turanians. I'm going to read from a few sources to reveal what the Turanians look like. First, I'm going to read from the National Quarterly Review, written in 1869. These tribes were Turan, who are spoken of by many authors as Kushites, in their religion similar to the general belief of the Turans spread over Asia, Africa, and Europe. Now I'm reading from the Church in the Gentile World at the First Promulgation by Augustus J. Theobald, written in 1878. Nations of Syria and Chaldea. Page 163. George Rawlinson proves that if its inhabitants were in the main Kushites, there was among them a strong admixture of Turanians, because, as he remarks, the language of the early inscriptions, though Kushite in its vocabulary, is Turanian in many points of its grammatical structure, as in its use of post-propositions, particles, and pronominal suffixes. It would seem therefore scarcely to admit of a doubt that the Kushites of Lower Babylonia must in some way or other have become mixed with a Turanian people. Rawlinson would not have felt any difficulty on the subject had he reflected that the best modern ethnographers class the Turanians among the Hamites and consequently consider them as close allies of the Kushites, descended likewise from Ham. Reading from JediSimon.com. Rawlinson identified these Akkadians as Turanian or Scythic people, but he made it clear that these ancient Scythic or Turanian speaking people were Kushites or blacks, so-called blacks, ebonies. Reading from the Cyclopedia of India and Eastern and Southern Asia, written in 1873. The Brahui tribes in Saharawa and Jahalawan, whose great chief is the Khan of Kailat, ethnologists consider to be of the same Scythic stock as the Dravidian race in the peninsula, and infer from this that the passage of the Dravidian tribes from Turan was along the valley of the Indus. The Brahui physical type is Scythic, and the language has strong Dravidian affinities. The Brahui is a genuine representative of the pre-Iranian population of southeast Irania and Baluchistan. The Jat, keep that name in mind, the Jat of Lower Indus appears to be of the same race as the Brahui and are almost black, so-called black, ebony toned. So as you can see, the Turanians were not Albions or Caucasoids. They were not Neanderthals, Reggie. The original Turanians were quite possibly related to Kushites or war Kushites. And remember, on page 3 of Suggestions for a History of the Maori, Francis Dart Fenton mentions that the Kushite Empire extended all the way to the Ganges River, which is in India. The original Turanians look like the Dravidians of India. You know what I'm saying? Look at what Dravidians look like. They are extremely dark-skinned people. They're not pale-skinned Albions or Albinoids or Caucasoids. You know what I'm saying? Those are our people still. I'm saying they may not have woolly hair, but they are most definitely original peoples. And keep in mind what I read from the Encyclopedia of India about the Brahui and Dravidian tribes who were from Turan, which means Dravidians were Turanians. And remember from part 1 of my video series, We Ain't Black, the map from the Myers Conversations Lexicon Encyclopedia, Dravidians are considered to be a part of the so-called Negroid race. Also from the same book, the author mentions how the Jats of India, were also the same people as the Dravidians. I'm going to speak about the Jats in a few minutes because the Jats were Moors of India. I'm going to read one more source about Chaldea before I finish summarizing suggestions for a history of the Maori people. I'm going to read from page 364 of a book titled Anacalypsis, written by Godfrey Higgins and published in the late 1870s. Page 364. In consequence of the prejudice, for it is really prejudice against the Negro, I ought rather to say against the possibility of a Negro being learned and scientific, arising from an acquaintance with the present Negro character, I admit with great difficulty the theory of all the early astronomical knowledge of the Chaldees or Chaldeans having been acquired or invented by his race, and that the Chaldees or Chaldeans were originally Negroes, that the Buddhists were Negroes, the icons of the god clearly prove. Alright, let's finish summarizing suggestions for a history of the Maori people. On page 11, Mr. Francis Darfinton states that the Ethiopians or Cushites had a capital city called Merik or Merik. That was a Chaldean god of war, and that the word Merik was changed into Mero by the Greeks. Also on page 11, Mr. Fenton says that the Arabian and African Cushites were always procreating with each other, and it was difficult to figure out if Punt, the Holy Land, or the land of the gods, was located in the African Kush to the south of Egypt, or if Punt was located in the Kush of Arabia. And another interesting fact, if you look up the location of the Himyarite Empire, which was located in modern Yemen, the Himyarites lived in the exact same location as the land of Punt. On page 89, Mr. Fenton, speaking about the Moriori of the Chatham Islands, and also that many of the Polynesians drifted to the Americas and that some of the tribes of California were related to Polynesians. Page 114 and 115 are some extremely crucial points in the book. Mr. Fenton establishes that the name Maori and Moriori are indeed indigenous and ethnic titles and may even be similar or the same name. And to cut it short, Mr. Fenton says that the Maori are the same people as the Sabians of Arabia, the Maruts, the Moors, the Mahri, and the Himyarites, and that they are the same people as the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, the Cushites, and the Akkadians. And the author also mentions that the words Maori or Moriori are of the same vernacular or language as the word Moor from Africa, meaning that they are the same word but different pronunciation. You know what I'm saying? Do you realize how important this is? This book basically told you that the Moors are related to all ancient cultures and exist beyond North Africa. You know what I'm saying? That's beautiful, ain't it? I watched a little bit of the debate between this guy who calls himself Dr. Reggie the Reject, Reggie the Reject, that's what I call him, and brother Sharif Bey. And Sharif made an excellent statement. He said that Moor is not a race because first and foremost there is no race. We have allowed the Albion to trick us into seeing other indigenous cultures as being of different races instead of simply seeing them as extensions of the original man and woman. I'm saying that's what we are, extensions of the original man and woman. All indigenous cultures are Moors. Now I'm going to read further to connect the Moors and the Maori to ancient Egypt. Remember on page 22 of 100 Amazing Facts About the Negro, J.A. Rogers says that Moor is one of the most ancient names that we have for ourselves, and it's from ancient Egypt. I'm going to be reading from the book titled Transactions and Proceedings of the New Zealand Institute, written by James Hector in 1886. Put in the full screen to read it. Page 546. The name Maori can be traced to Turanian India. Mr. W. L. Rankin, in his essay on Maori migrations, already quoted from, speaking of the name Maori as applied to themselves by the copper-colored Polynesians, says, "This name varies with dialects of the different groups. It is in some Mahoe, in others Maori, and in many Mahori." On the one hand, peopling of the islands of the light-colored Polynesians; on the other, and in intimate connection with Phoenicians, the northern regions of Africa, the former the Maori or Mahori, the latter the Maori or Maori, inhabitants of Mauritania, later known as Moors. The late Reverend R. Taylor suspected that there was a connection between the names Maori and Moor, but in common with others, he imagined that the Maori races represented one or more of the lost tribes of Israel, and thus the Moor being deemed an Arab, he accounted for racial affinity. But the true explanation is to be found in the fact that both Hebrew and Maori inherited, equally with the Phoenicians, much that is common both to Egypt, Phoenicia, Babylonia, and India, that is, Turanian customs and traditions. Another feature that points to the connection of Maori, Egyptian, and Turanian tradition is the connection of the Atua Potiki, or child gods of the Maoris, with the Ptah of Egypt, and the Patekos of Phoenicia. The Phoenician Patiki were the children of Ptah or Ptah, also called children of Sadiq. The Egyptian Ptah equals the opener and was represented by a bow-legged dwarf or fetus, equals the Phoenician Patekos, the creator of the world, the sun and the moon out of chaos, Ha, or matter, Mu. These quotations from Chambers' Encyclopedia enable me to confirm much that I have advanced about the Maori Tiki, conclusions that I arrived at before I came across this further evidence. Here we have Ptah, Patekos, and Potiki equals the child or opener of the womb of nature. The anthropomorphic deity or creator represented as a bow-legged dwarf or fetus. That's further proof that the Maori are Moors and connects the Moors to ancient Egypt. Another book source I'm going to read from is A Book of Beginnings by Gerald Massey, written in 1881, page 590. That the name Tameri is the land of Meru, whence Meru and the ancient Meroe was once the capital of two Egypts under this name. The first lower and upper were north and south, but the Maori or Mauru is north and west. Meroe in Ethiopia was due north from the equator, but reckoning from Central Africa or from Habesh, Abyssinia, we shall find the land of the ancient Mauri, Mauritania. Thus we have a Mauri for the country northwest in Africa, answering to the Maori name of the northwest as Mauru. This name for a land lying northwest of the African center, always reckoning from the south, would deposit the names of the Maori land, Marmarica, a duplicated form, and Morocco, as the Maori or Moors went farther north into Spain or Zephon. From these and other data may be drawn the inference that the Maori people were self-named as the immigrants who came from the northwest, one name of which is Mauru, Egyptian Meru, Meroe, or the Mehru. The Maori name is that of the later Moors. I'm saying beautiful information, ain't it? Of course, I gotta bring up E.A. Wallace Budge, Egyptian Hieroglyphic Dictionary. Merper, chief of the house, steward, major domo, plural. Merper, chief steward. Merper nub, or noob, overseer of the gold foundry. Merper hetch, overseer of the silver foundry. Mer, overseer, chief officer, head, superintendent, director, foreman, plural. Mur'aut, inspector of dignities of the highest kind. Muru'awat, heads of families, sheiks of tribes. Mur'at, overseer of the estates, land superintendent. Mur'ahu, inspector of cattle. Mur'ah, chief of the caravan, chief of caravans, see Sphinx. Mur'a'inset, chief of the mountain tract. Ta-Merah, or Ta-Meri, the land of Merah, Mary, Egypt. Ta-Mera'u, the people of the land of the Nile flood, i.e. the Egyptians. Merah, an ancient name of Egypt. Ptah, or Ptah, Merah, the land of Merah. Mer, or Meru, desert, plain, mountain. And pyramid, of course, is Mer. Now let's speak about the Easter Island or Rapa Nui Moai statues. For the longest, I've heard Moors make the claim that those red things on the top of the Moai has something to do with fezzes. You know what I'm saying? I used to think it was a joke. I actually thought it was a joke until I actually did my research and I came across more amazing information. Those red things at the top of the Moai are known as pukeos, and they serve as a sign of status and royalty in Rapa Nui culture. A pukeo could be something as simple as dressing the hair up into a top knot, or the pukeo was also a feathered crown, oftentimes a red feathered crown, because red is a symbol of power in the Pacific Island cultures. And the only people who could wear these feathered crowns or pukeos were known as Ariki Ma'us, who were seen as paramount chiefs or head chiefs, almost like kings almost. And those moai were erected to honor the ancestors and the Ariki Ma'u, and those red pukeos are their red feathered crowns. And just to speak about the lineage and history of the Rapa Nui people, so the beginning of Rapa Nui history began with a continent known as Hiva. And if you do your research on Hiva, Hiva was actually another name for Mu or Lemuria. I'm saying do the research, I'm not making this up. So basically there was a sort of cataclysm that happened on the continent of Hiva. The same story as Mu, because Hiva is Mu or Lemuria. The cataclysm caused most of Hiva to be submerged under the ocean. And all of those, I heard there's like around 20,000 islands in the Pacific Ocean. And all of these islands are the remnants of Hiva. And one of the ancestors of the Rapa Nui people was an inhabitant of Hiva, and his name was Hotu Matua. Hotu Matua was pretty much the founder of Rapa Nui or Easter Island after searching for a new homeland because of the cataclysms on Hiva. Hotu Matua is also the first Ariki Ma'u of Rapa Nui. So you're probably wondering, what does all of this have to do with the Moors, right? While doing my research, I discovered that there is a direct and royal lineage that leads back to Hotu Matua and the first settlers of Rapa Nui. And guess what their name was? The Meru. Literally, they were called the Meru clan. You know what I'm saying? That's not a joke. Just like the Maori and the Moriori, who were Moors, the Meru clan were also Moors. I'm going to read a few sources that speak about the Meru, starting with World Monarchies and Dynasties by John Middleton. Among the tribes on Easter Island, the Meru were the highest ranking group, for they claimed to be the direct descendants of the island's first settler, Hotu Matua, the high chief of the island, who also served in a priestly role, came from the Meru tribe. In contrast, civil and religious powers were separated on the island of Mangala, part of the Cook Islands, where hereditary kings were entrusted with spiritual duties and a victorious warrior was chosen as the head of government. Now I'm reading from Skeletal Biology of the Ancient Rapa Nui, Easter Islanders, by Vincent H. Steffen and George W. Gill. When queried which Easter Island family had members who looked like the ancient Rapa Nui man, they all independently said or answered the Hairy Very family. One of us, Gil, rechecked the site information of the original skull to be certain that it had, as thought, come from Ahu Na'u Na'u, the home area of the Meru tribe, the royal lineage of the ancient Rapa Nui. It had. Then genealogical records from Easter Island were consulted. They list modern families descended from the ancient Meru. Among those listed is Harry Very. To speak more about the Pukeos, I'm going to read from Splendid Isolation, Art of Easter Island by Eric Kjeligren, Joanne Van Tilburg, and Adrian Lois Kepler. Page 37. The importance of color and material for a head covering is apparent in the top knots Pukeo of the stone moai, which are red, the sacred Polynesian color. Only individuals of the highest social rank wore bark cloth headdresses. Other high status individuals wore feather headdresses. Coiled circlets of plant fiber usually covered the iridescent black rooster feathers, some of which projected in elaborate crescents. Bark cloth or feather headdresses were worn on special occasions by chiefs and other prominent individuals as symbols of their rank. There are more book sources out there, but you can do your own research on the Meru of Rapa Nui. But as you can see, the Meru is an actual lineage. And if the Pukeo was a sign of royalty, and only those of the highest social status could wear them, and the Meru had the highest social status on the island, then that means that most of those Moai who are wearing the Pukeos, those are Merus and are Moors. So when you hear Moors bring up the subject of the Easter Island Moai and those red Pukeos, you know what I'm saying, it's not a joke. Moors are exact and correct when they compare those Pukeos to fezzes. And for those who may be skeptical about the Maori being Moors, I can point you to a video called Moai in New Zealand Maori Sovereignty Explained by a man named John Wanoa. You know what I'm saying? Look it up on YouTube ASAP. In the video, at 2 minutes and 45 seconds, Mr. Wanoa states that all of the Pacific Islands were once connected and formed a continent called Mu, and that Mu sunk under the ocean and gave rise to the Pacific Islands. And at 9 minutes and 15 seconds, Mr. Wanoa makes the connection between the Pacific Islanders and the Nubians. At 19 minutes and 18 seconds, Mr. Wanoa makes another connection between the Pacific Islanders and the Moai and connects them to the Egyptian obelisks, and he continuously mentions the sun god Ra. And this is where he spills all the beans. At 26 minutes and 13 seconds, Mr. Wanoa says that the Pacific Islanders' bloodline and DNA goes all the way back to the Nubians and the Egyptians of North Africa. Basically saying that yes, the Maori are Moors. You know what I'm saying? Go watch the video right now. Moai in New Zealand Maori Sovereignty Explained by John Wanoa. Go watch it right now. You know what I'm saying? Just don't take my word for it. This was an actual flesh and blood New Zealand Maori admitting this. You know what I'm saying? Go listen with your own ears right now. Now I'm going to speak about the Jats of India, who I also said were Moors. Remember how I was reading the Cyclopedia of India by Edward Balfour to discuss the identity of the Turanians. And the book said that the Dravidians were the same people as the Jats, and that the Jats were so-called black or ebony tone people, right? I'm going to be reading information about Chandragupta Maurya and the Gupta and Mauryan empires of India. You know what I'm saying? It could be a little confusing because it's a very long history that I'm still learning about, but I'm going to do my best. So you have what are called Gotras, which are clans and lineages in India. The Mauryans and Guptas were ruling families and clans of Jats. The Mauryan Empire was founded by Chandragupta Maurya, which was from the time period of about 320 BC to around 180 BC. The Gupta Empire began hundreds of years later, around 320 AD. Even though the Gupta Empire was hundreds of years after Chandragupta Maurya founded the Mauryan Empire, there were rulers of the Gupta Empire named Chandragupta. Supposedly the names or titles of Gupta and Chandragupta are popular names in Indian culture. And if you look up ancient artwork and depictions of the Guptas and the Mauryans, you know what I'm saying, there's no mistaking what these people look like. I'm going to be reading from Jatland.com to discuss the name Mauryan. It says Mauryans were Jats. According to Ram Swarup June, Mauryans being Jats were denigrated by Brahmins and were termed even Shudras to show their contempt. In fact, Maurya was not a caste, but it was a gotra of Jats, which is still found in Jats. The existence of Koye, Maurya, Gotra, and Jats proves that the Mauryans were Jats. Gupta was a title of Chandragupta and not the caste, as has been proven below in the history of Chandragupta. He was a warrior of the Jat caste. In the list of Jat clans we find Maurya, Maur, Mauri, Maurya, Morsara, Morwa, Morwal, and Maurya. All of these are Jat gotras of very old standing, hence the rule of this dynasty has been given a high place in history of Jats. Referring to the origin of the Maur Jats, Tribes and Castes says that Maur is so called because of the peacock Maur protected their ancestor from a snake. As already mentioned, all of these are baseless theories because of the premise that Maur stands for the peacock itself is baseless. From the above mentioned discussion, it is clear that Maur is not an Indian word and has no connection whatsoever with the peacock. It is a Central Asian clan name of the Jats and means the head or the crown. Thus we can conclude that the correct name of the clan of Chandragupta was Maur. It is the same word which is the surname of some people in England and is written as Moor. It is again this word which is the European Moor. Similarly, the Moor of India are the same as the Moor of Europe. So this means that not only is the word Maori the same word as Moor, the word Mauryan is also the same word as Moor. You know what I'm saying? They're just different pronunciations of the same word, and most importantly, they are all the same people. And I want to read something else from Anacalypsis by Godfrey Higgins to speak about the depictions of the original inhabitants of Asia in the so-called Middle East. It says, Mr. Wilsford, in his treatise on Egypt and the Nile, in the Asiatic Researches, informs us that many very ancient statues of the god Buddha in India have crisp, curly hair, with flat noses and thick lips, and adds, nor can it be reasonably doubted that a race of Negroes formerly had power and preeminence in India. This is confirmed by Mr. Maurice, who says, the figures in the Hindu caverns are of a very different character from the present race of Hindus. Their countenances are broad and full, the nose flat, and the lips, particularly the underlip, remarkably thick. The description of the hair is extremely important. You know what I'm saying? That stuff at the top of Buddha's head, you know what I'm saying, that isn't just for decoration. That's a representation of our nappy, woolly peppercorn hair. Those spirals that you see represent our tightly coiled hair. You know how we have hair like sheep's or lamb's wool. All of the ancient cultures in Asia depicted the hair as being tightly coiled and spirally. You know what I'm saying? Those things that look like little spiral galaxies or something. In many of the depictions of the Khmer or Khmers, the Moors of Cambodia, they are depicted as having what appear to be dreadlocks or braids. And of course the huge faces look like the Olmec, the MOORS of the Americas. And a lot of times those spirals can even be straight up Bantu knots. You know what I'm saying? It's all a representation of our tightly coiled hair. Some people call it non-ether hair or whatever. You can look up all the wall paintings from India, like the Ajanta or Ellora cave paintings, to see what the Turanians and the original Indians look like. Most people already know about the Asiatic depictions, but many people didn't know that this was the same case for the ancient cultures of Mesopotamia. All of those wall reliefs from Persia, Babylonia, Chaldea, Anatolia, etc. Those little spirals of hair represent the same thing, our tightly coiled hair. the beards, the hair on top of the heads. You know what I'm saying? Those amalgamations walking around the Middle East can't produce that. That's all us. It's the same exact thing with the Venuses of Europe, like the Venus of Willendorf. That is a depiction of woolly hair on top of her head. You know what I'm saying? I wanted to spend more time on this subject, but I already went over time, and I got one more book source I want to read from. But when you do your own research, you will find out that we are the original inhabitants of Europe. All of those Venuses are depictions of us, the original woman with woolly hair. The Albion or the Caucasoid isn't even the original European. We are. You can always read books like 100 Amazing Facts About the Negro, or the Ancient and Modern Britons, which all speak about the Grimaldi, and the Aurignacians. The Albion has no true history on the planet. Even those Greek statues are all fakes. That's why they look so brand new. The true and authentic Greek statues all have braids and woolly hair like the Minoans and the Etruscans. The authentic statues actually look like they were made 1,000 years ago, unlike these fakes they show in the museums. I got one more interesting book I want to read before I end the video. The author was hypothesizing that all of the ancient cultures were related, but he didn't know that he was actually correct. I'm going to be reading from All the Year Round, Volume 62, written by Charles Dickens in 1888. Toltecs and Aztecs. But besides killing, man has almost everywhere gone in for building, from Baalbek and Palmyra to Easter Island, from Java and Cambodia to the mound cities of Ohio. The earth is full of his works. Sometimes, as in the case of the mound cities and the avenues of rude granite pillars at Karnak in Brittany, the builders cannot even be guessed at. Sometimes, as in the case of the Mexican pyramids and temples and palaces, we know their name, but are wholly in the dark as to their parentage. It was the Toltecs, humane, civilized predecessors of the Aztecs, who the latest archaeologists assure us filled the Mexican upland valley and Yucatan and other parts of Central America with vast structures, often covered with most elaborate carving. But who were the Toltecs, and why are some parts of Mexico and the neighboring countries full of their work, while in others there is no trace of them? A suggestion towards answering this last query may be the absence or presence of suitable stone, that to a great extent determines the architecture of a country. The pottery of the Toltecs, for instance, has a general likeness to that of the old Peruvians, but then many of the vases have a Greek look, some resembling those dug up by Dr. Schliemann in the lower strata of that succession of cities, one of which was Troy, some as graceful as the most purely classical forms. Then again, they built pyramids as did the old Egyptians. But a Toltec pyramid is almost always truncated, the top being often the site of a temple, placed there to be seen afar off, or it may be to avoid the floods to which in prehistoric times the Mexican valley may have been subject. Have they any connection with the Ohio mounds? He says, seemingly none. For while the Toltec structures are truncated stone pyramids, the mounds are of earth, roughly shaped like colossal beavers, bisons, and other creatures. Speaking about the sculptures now, some again have round their sides thoroughly cross-legged figures with turbans, Hindu in character, while several of the statues found at Tuscala are in headdress and type of face strangely like the earliest Egyptian work. One thing strikes everybody: these Toltecs, if such they were, had remarkably receding foreheads. One notes that on the medallions, which are as great a feature of the room cornices at Palenque as they are of those in a French Renaissance chateau, sometimes the hair is dressed much like the same as in the French, but the forehead always slopes back unnaturally. Most of all in the figures of their gods, who with their Roman noses and full heavy jaws are not unlike a certain type of medieval Ecclesiastic. One thinks of the flathead Indians and wonders if similarity of custom shows identity of race. According to the old Spanish writers, this forehead flattening was confined to priests and nobles, and they have pretty well died out. Though we must not forget that still, to be a true blood Indian is an honor. He ranks not only above mestizos, mulattoes, and other hybrids, but above the descendants of the Spaniards. These Toltecs, then, we are as much at sea about them as ever. Were they a part of that race which carved the huge images on Easter Island and sculpted the earliest monuments in Hindustan and carried its arts into Egypt, where arts as well as workmen underwent a notable change? Was there ever such a race? Who knows? Tradition says that the Toltecs came in from the northwest, which makes it seem as if some of them came from further Asia by way of Polynesia. Their civilizers may have done so, for as the Peruvians had their Manco Capac, so they had their god of wisdom, virgin-born Quetzalcoatl, who taught the arts of life, and then disappeared, vowing he should come again. Interesting. So Mr. Dickens just asked a question. Were the people who carved the Easter Island heads the same as the people who carved the ancient monuments in Hindustan or India? And he asked, were they the same people as the ancient Egyptians? Right? Mr. Dickens made the mistake of assuming that because the builders of the Ohio mounds used earth instead of stone, that they were not the same people as the Toltecs or Olmecs. And he also made a mistake in assuming that because the pyramids of the Americas are truncated or flat-topped, that they couldn't have been built by the same people who built the African pyramids. If Mr. Dickens was alive today, I would tell him that his hypothesis was correct, that all of the Easter Island Moai, the pyramids of Africa, Europe, and the Americas, the temples of India and Asia, and the earth mounds of North America were all built by the same people. They were all built by Moors, MOORS, Maori, Tamarians, the Maru, the Khmers. You know what I'm saying? Yes, they were all the same people. All indigenous and original cultures are Moors. We all were seafarers. We all traveled every inch of the earth. We all built all those ancient structures. I'm saying we have to deprogram our minds from seeing each other as separate races and realize that we are extensions of the original Moabite woman. And with that, I'm going to say please share this information. And yes, we are all Moors. Peace and thanks for watching the video.